English translation, 684th Contact Part 2. Saturday the 8th of July 2017. 22:08 hours.
Then something else. When I was in Bülach in 1949 with teacher Gustav Lehmann in the 4th grade, he once spoke, when he was talking about slavery, about the Zurich Eschers, who kept about 100 slaves in Cuba and exploited them for all they were worth in terms of work and became rich as a result. But Gustav Lehmann taught that this was vehemently denied by the early Eschers and their families, which is why I then also asked your father Svath what the reality and truth was. To which he replied that teacher Lehmann was telling the truth, because earlier Eschers had indeed kept slaves in Cuba, whereby, if I remember correctly, an uncle, Fritz Escher, played a special role. I do not remember whether the name Alfred Escher was also mentioned in the conversation with Svath, only the name Fritz Escher. Now Jacobus has told me about this article here in the Tagesanzeiger, which also speaks of what my teacher Lehmann and your father said. I found another interesting piece of information on the internet and copied it out, which I am sure many human beings will be interested in, but it does not say whether this Alfred Escher also had anything to do with slaveholding. Johann Heinrich Alfred Escher vom Glas, called Alfred Escher * the 20th of February 1819 in Zurich, the 6th of December 1882 in Zurich Enge, was a Swiss politician, business leader, and railway entrepreneur. Through his numerous political offices and his founding and leadership activities at the Swiss Northeast Railway, the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, the Schweizerische Kreditanstalt, the Schweizerische Lebensversicherungs- und Rentenanstalt, and the Gotthard Railway Company, Escher exerted an influence on the political and economic development of Switzerland in the 19th century like no other. So over time, even if it often takes a very long time, reality and its truth in terms of lies and secrets find their way into the light.
An old and wise word.
Now I want to bring up the G20 summit, which
is fundamentally nonsensical in the way it is conducted and dealt with on the one hand, and on the other hand, it costs the peoples of all participating states great financial resources. The whole thing brings, as has always been the case since these meetings were held, no progress worth mentioning or any progress at all in terms of economic benefit, as well as in terms of a culture of peace and freedom among nations or the world.
I do not think that's debatable, but at least what I find positive about this G20 summit is what Putin and Trump have agreed to regarding a ceasefire in a larger Syrian area. However, I dare to doubt whether the whole thing will hold as agreed, because from the US side what has been decided can be called into question again sooner or later, given the US fickleness and the many unkept promises over the centuries, as well as the underhandedness. In fact, I would be surprised if the whole thing was effectively kept. And that nothing peaceful can be expected from the USA is also proven by all the wars that can be traced back to this state and have claimed millions of lives, for which US America has never been held accountable and probably never will be. Exactly with regard to the wars that are constantly being launched by the USA. I have the following article, which Occam emailed to us, and which tells us what wars the USA has launched since the end of the Third World War after 1945 up to the present day.
United States responsible for 81% of all wars. Published by Alpenschau, the 28th of June, 2017.
Of the 248 armed conflicts since the end of World War II, the United States has started 201 and murdered more than 30 million human beings. The United States has been at war for 222 years, since its founding in 1776. That is over 90% of the total time of this nation's existence. No American president has been truly qualified to go down in history as a peace president. Instead, all U.S. presidents can practically be described as war presidents and the worst butchers. Facts. Since World War II, Earth has experienced 248 armed conflicts. The US started 201.81% of them. In these armed attacks, more than 30 million human beings have been murdered by the American military. 90% of these deaths are millions of innocent children, elderly and ordinary workers, as well as civilian women and men. The Americans have murdered more human beings in all these wars than Hitler's Nazis. Official reports confirm that all the reasons the US gave for the armed attacks were demonstrably false. The United States has not had a single decade in its history without war. The only time they managed to stay without war was 5 years from 1935 to 1940, during the isolationist period of the Great Depression. Source: Der Wachter die Alpenschau bedankt sich. Vereinigte Staaten für 81% aller Kriegverantwortlich.
Your concerns are valid, and what this article says should be enough to make pro-America people realize whose conscious child those in charge of the U.S. are.
You can say that out loud, but it is simply, try before you trust. But something else in relation to the G20 summit. What do you think of the chaotic people who marched from several countries to the G20 summit and are effectively causing terror? In my opinion, the whole thing of these disguised idiots has nothing to do with a useful demonstration through which something valuable could be achieved in politics, but with terrorism. Effectively, everything is aimed only at terror and destruction, at idiotic and evil gavolt, at setting cars on fire, etc. Damaging, hitting, beating, kicking, disabling, hurting, breaking, smashing, crushing, shattering, pounding, battering, bashing, demolishing, trampling, destroying, smashing and ruining, and all this just to satisfy the mania for degeneracy and destruction, for beating up and hurting the forces of law and order, for shouting and primitive instincts, and to cause as much damage as possible, for which the working and tax-paying people have to pay again, and pay for everything.
This is undeniably as you say.
Then I have another article by Occam here that you should read.
Ta reads,
Could the universe have consciousness? Fernando Calvo, Terra Mystica, Tuesday, the 27th of June, 2017, 1440 Universal Time Coordinated.
Copyright NASA/ESA/ESO.
The idea that the universe could have consciousness has fascinated both scientists and philosophers for centuries. This reasoning is based on the metaphysical theory known as panpsychism, which holds that not only does the universe possess consciousness, but all objects within it also have the capacity to think and direct their paths. Panpsychism is the development of spiritual note, consciousness, and mental qualities, the basic structures for which are already present as preliminary stages in the material world. These preliminary stages are often called proto-mental qualities. Panpsychism does not assume that atoms or bacteria, for example, can experience pain or similar states of consciousness, nor that all things have a soul. That is, while everything in the universe possesses these proto-mental properties, not everything also develops a consciousness from them. And it may sound strange, but the theory also has a growing number of supporters among scientists. Because even though it seems pretty fantastic, it is very difficult to disprove it definitively. Physicist Gregory Matloff of New York City College of Technology only recently published a new study on the Subject, and in it he explains that a proto-consciousness field could have extended across the entire universe, and thus the cosmos, just like us human beings, could have developed a consciousness. It is all very speculative, but it is something we can verify and either confirm or disprove, he says. Much of what defines panpsychism today stems from the work of British physicist Sir Roger Penrose, who 30 years ago was already promoting the idea that the consciousness of the universe was rooted in the statistical rules of quantum physics and related to the microscopic spaces between neurons in the brain. Penrose was in turn inspired by the idea of the German physicist Bernhard Hayes, who speculated that the quantum fields that permeate empty space are responsible for the transmission of consciousness. This would then be able to unfold not only in our own brains, but in any sufficiently complex structure. However, whether this can actually ever be proven and understood by us remains to be seen. Source: Conti das Universum über ein Bewusstseinverfügen.
Really interesting. I suppose you want this inserted into our conversation?
Exactly. While the article is for the Zeitzeichen, which I will of course put it in, I think it might also be of interest in our conversation.
No doubt about it.
Then once again I would like to say something that will take some time, if it is all right with you, my friend. But it would take a little longer.
Of course, nothing is beyond him.
Good, thanks, because there's been something on my mind for over a month now that I would like to say. There was a program on television some time ago about how this and that kind of insect should best be exterminated because they would transmit diseases to human beings and also be deadly. For my part, I find that idiotic because I learned something different from your father Svath, and also from you, and I know that actually all genera and species of insects are important and all have their certain tasks, and also those that can sometimes be very annoying, but which can be fought off in various ways without having to exterminate them. Although I learned a lot about insects from your father Svath and at school, what I have continued to learn about these diverse life forms until today really shows me how very important and indispensable insects are in many ecosystems. The fact that many insect genera and species play a very important role in the reproduction of plants, for example, as well as in soil fertility, is probably unknown to most human beings. Especially those diverse insects that perform their important pollination work on fruit blossoms, flowers, herbs, and all kinds of inflorescences on all kinds of food plants make an invaluable and immeasurable contribution to supplying the human beings with food. But all these many insect species are threatened, and in some cases their situation is not only not good, but effectively precarious. In all the time of the mass increase of the Earth's population, especially in the past decades, not only the number of insect species has drastically decreased, but also the number of individual life forms in terms of their genera and species. In part, the losses in this regard are extremely dramatic, but this is neither known to the majority of humanity, nor would they care if they knew this fact. The mere fact that many areas of the Earth are experiencing drastic losses of bees, moths, various flying mice and beetle species, butterflies, hoverflies, and other flower and flower-pollinating insects already heralds a dire emergency situation, which is already leading, as in China, for example, to human beings themselves having to carry out the necessary flower pollination so that fruit and other flower-dependent and thus pollination-requiring foodstuffs can still grow. And indeed, an increasingly rapid dramatic insect die-off is being observed worldwide, with the biomass of flying insects having declined by 80% between 1989 and 2014 alone, as I recently read in a technical article. These losses of insects of various genera and species put entire food chains at risk, because if the necessary insects are missing, on the one hand, more and more plants are no longer pollinated, while on the other hand, the food basis is also increasingly missing for insectivorous bird species, amphibians and lizards, as well as other insect species. The fact is that a large proportion of useful and food plants, as well as fruit-bearing trees, bushes and shrubs, are dependent on pollinating insects, so that food shortages occur very quickly when harvests are lost due to non-pollination of food plants, especially berries, fruits, and vegetables. In addition to pollination, the danger of natural dispersal of plants of various kinds is also becoming more and more precarious, as biodiversity continues to decline, and this is because poisons from agriculture and horticulture are increasingly reducing certain bird species of all kinds, which also contribute to the spread of various plants, as do ants, various beetles, squirrels, and other creatures that collect and distribute seeds. Pollinating insects are under pressure for a variety of reasons, most of which come from various human activities, especially the unthinking and criminal use of pesticides, which kill off the necessary insects and their broods. On the other hand, the landscapes and thus the habitats as well as the diversity of the plants growing there are also being changed and destroyed, and thus also the habitats and food for many insects pollinating the flowers. The effective fact is that about 1.38 million diverse life forms are known on Earth. But Yaren declare that about 12 million living beings of the most diverse genera and species are still unknown on the entire globe and consequently have not been researched. Of the mentioned number of living beings, that is to say 1.38 million, as taught according to earthly zoology. According to earthly entomology or insectology, the majority of them, just under 1 million species, belong to the class of insects, whereby in Europe there are about 34,000 species. Insects are mostly perceived as a nuisance by human beings, who are also not very interested in these living beings, which is why they are also not interested in their importance in ecosystems. Consequently, they either completely neglect learning and knowledge about them or do not perceive the whole of insects as particularly important. However, this is probably not simply due to their size, but rather to the indifference and disinterest of human beings with regard to nature and its fauna and flora. Of course, most genera and species of insects are only a few millimeters in size and also live predatorily or as parasites. But it is generally the case that human beings, out of sheer ignorance, regard the majority of all insects as pests. This is especially the case when certain of them cause crop failures, such as the Colorado potato beetle. Some insect species are also known to transmit diseases, which is why medical entomology, as a branch of entomology, deals with the relationship of insects to human beings' health, because insects can severely damage the health of human beings by transmitting and causing dangerous diseases through the transmission of viruses or bacteria. For this purpose, I have here an older list that I have had in my computer for a good 3 years and would like to read out. Insect pathogens: yellow fever caused by mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti. Pathogen of dengue fever by mosquitoes. By transmission of bacteria. Pathogen of dysentery by flies. Plague caused by fleas. Causative agent of spotted fever by lice and fleas. By transmission of plasmodia. The causative agent of malaria by Anopheles mosquitoes. The pathogens migrate from the mosquito's intestine to the salivary glands. When bitten, the pathogens enter the human being's bloodstream. They enter the liver, where they multiply. Back in the blood, they destroy red blood cells and release fever-inducing substances. Worldwide, about 400 million human beings contract malaria every year. About 2 million human beings die every year from this most common tropical disease. Through transmission of flagellates, pathogen of sleeping sickness by tsetse flies genus Glossina. After being bitten by the tsetse fly, the pathogens enter the human being's brain via the blood. They cause irreversible neurological changes in the brain. During the day, the sick person falls into passivity and sleepy listlessness, hence the name sleeping sickness. The sick person gradually loses more and more weight and finally dies. About 500,000 human beings contract sleeping sickness every year. Probably 80% of the sick person die. Different genera and species of insects can look extremely different and yet all have common features, such as that their bodies are divided into 3 sections and that there are antennae or feelers on the head, compound eyes, and mouth limb masses. 6 legs are attached to the middle part of the body, which is why the class of insects was also called hexapoda in Latin, or six-footed. If the insects have wings, they are attached to the middle part of the body, while most of the internal organs are located in the abdomen. In the article I read, it was stated that all insects lay eggs, with further development then usually proceeding through several stages, while offspring take on very different forms depending on the insect in terms of metamorphosis, such as a larval and pupal stage. Insects, however, must not be lumped together with spiders, as Eupleyaren also say, who differentiate all life forms, as in insects, beetles, spiders, mammals, reptiles, birds, amphibians, worms, and fish, etc., while earthlings as a whole simply call everything animals, which I honestly find confusing, but your differentiation clear, logical, and effective. So spiders do not belong to the class of insects, because they belong to the scorpions and ticks, and also do not have 6 but 8 legs, just as their body is roughly divided into 2 segments. The usual perception of insects by the majority of human beings is extremely poor, and it is probably only known to entomologists and a few people interested in insects that there are around 20,000 different species of wild bees worldwide that perform pollination tasks. However, bee colonies in particular are threatened by various parasites, especially the varroa mite, as a result of which entire bee colonies are wiped out, with such a colony often numbering 40,000 individuals, or sometimes more in the month of June. There are also many species of butterflies, flies, moths, beetles and wasps that pollinate a wide variety of plants, but also various birds, bats, and other life forms of many different genera and species, even if they are of much less importance in this respect. In the main, therefore, it is the effective professional pollinators that fertilize the various flowers by transferring pollen between male and female plant parts, whereby these fertilized inflorescences then also actually produce fruit. So the pollinating insects, etc., enable the plants to bear fruit and also reproduce through their seeds. So the vast majority of wild and cultivated plants depend on insect pollination and a few other life forms. But a certain proportion of other plants are self-pollinators or wind pollinators, in that they pollinate themselves or are pollinated by a transfer of pollen by the wind or by water. Pollinating insects seek out flowering plants primarily because they feed on pollen and nectar. But not all insects are generalized to all flowers, and consequently various insects are only specialized in certain flowering plants. I learned from Svath that about 90% of flowering plants depend on pollination by living creatures, while the remaining 10% are pollinated by self-pollination or by the wind, or, in rarer cases, also by water. In water pollination, your father Svath explained, pollen is transported through the water and the plants are pollinated in this way. In nature, therefore, pollinator life forms play the central role 90% in ensuring stability in all food chains, because berries, fruits, vegetables, and flowers of plants with their nectar serve as food for very many life forms, including the human beings. In addition, plants, like the pollinator life forms themselves, provide a habitat for other and tiny life forms, microbes or microorganisms, small organisms and microscopic organisms consisting of individual cells or cell aggregates. Microbes include bacteria, eubacteria, bacteria, Archaebacteria archaea, a large proportion of fungi including yeasts, many algae, and the protozoa single-celled organisms. Particularly in horticulture and agriculture, pollination of the blossoms of trees, shrubs, bushes, grasses, and other plants of all kinds is of the utmost importance, because for 3/4 of the most important horticultural and agricultural products, their pollination determines both the harvest quantities and the quality of the products. If pollinators were to disappear completely, there would be major crop losses. A total loss of pollination of the flowers of some important food and other crops would result in a harvest loss of up to 93%, and thus in food shortages and famine. However, it is not only the direct food for human beings that would be in short supply, because a loss of pollination would also affect the fauna and flora, and thus the entire ecosystems, which also includes all forests worldwide, of which around 80% of all trees, bushes and shrubs and other plants are pollinated by insects. beetles and birds, etc. In the European forests, these include the forests of the Mediterranean, the Mediterranean, the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean. In European forests, these include above all maple, sweet chestnut, cherry, lime, horse chestnut, rowan, willow, and hawthorn, as well as many flower-bearing ground plants. And as difficult as it is for lay people to understand, it is the insects of all things that do a lot for the energy and nutrient influxes in the forests and regulate them to a large extent. Many insects eat leaves and needles, whereby the plant material is digested and the excrement reaches the soil, which is then further processed by microorganisms. In this way, the natural cycle takes place, whereby the nutrients are made available again, new humus is created, and the forest soil is loosened and made fertile. This is a process that is also naturally present in every garden and agricultural soil, but is prevented by the application of poisons, the extermination of insects and other life forms, and the concreting over of meadows, gardens, meadows, and fields, which ultimately leads to the leaching of the soil, which only remains fertile with all kinds of artificial fertilizers and produces ever leaner harvests. In the forests themselves, many species of insects work in various ways for the benefit of the forest and all life forms, so also for human beings. For example, various insects contribute to the decomposition of dead wood by crushing it and its bark, thereby doing the groundwork for microorganisms that completely decompose all the material, returning it all to the natural cycle and placing it within it, allowing new life to form again. Insects sometimes also colonize diseased trees and cause them to die, which ensures that the health of the forest is promoted. But even all this is only a small part of the whole benefit that insects provide, because effectively they do much more, such as recycling the droppings and carcasses of other life forms, up to and including large forest animals, as the pill borer does in the beetle world. However, just as insects also utilize other insects and their droppings as well as their dead bodies, they in turn serve as food for day and night birds, such as woodpeckers, tits or sparrows, as well as for other life forms, such as lizards, frogs and mice and bats, etc. In addition, many insects also eat other insect species, thus regulating the ratio of genera and species, which normally prevents the mass occurrence of insects. This is normally the case, because nowadays it is no longer possible to speak of normally, because through the criminal and irresponsible intervention of human beings in nature and its fauna and flora with deadly poisons, destruction and poisoning, everything has fallen out of normality, and consequently, the laws of nature and all natural life have fallen out of any natural order. Especially the neonicotinoids, which have been used in agriculture since the mid-1990s to control pests, have an extremely destructive, exterminating effect and are particularly dangerous for bees, although they also kill countless beneficial insects in addition to the so-called target species, which are called harmful insects, as you explained to me some time ago. However, with regard to the extermination of insects, there are other factors that have a destructive and devastating effect on the whole of nature, and thus on fauna and flora, such as the intensive cultivation of floodplains, fields, gardens, forests, and meadows. As a result, all beneficial insects, butterflies, beetles, hornets, day and night birds and wasps, etc., as well as small and large mammals of all genera and species have less food and habitat and consequently migrate to villages and cities, or simply become ill and die miserably. More intensive cultivation and multiple mowing, as well as the increased grazing of cows, cattle, bulls, goats, and sheep, are increasingly causing the loss of flowering plant diversity, just as the irresponsible use of herbicides as weed killers is causing a catastrophic reduction in flowering offerings, even to the point of complete extinction. On the contrary, everything possible should be done, no matter how high the financial costs, to preserve the diversity of all life forms and all their habitats in all rural, village, and urban areas. For this to happen, however, it is necessary that all herbicides and pesticides should not only be reduced and their use reduced, but that they should be banned completely. For these toxins are not only deadly and exterminating to insects and other life forms of all kinds in the wild, but they are also pathogenic to human beings and may also be deadly. Also, the diversity of flowers in smaller areas. On roadsides as well as in small beds in gardens, in borders, and as windowsill decorations, etc. must be urgently promoted, preserved, and become reality again. Organic farming must also be geared towards restoring flowering grasses, for example clover, flowering perennials, flowering shrubs and wildflowers, as well as regenerating flower meadows and cornfields with cornflowers and poppies, etc., so that pollinating insects can once again do their work, which is also vital for human beings, and fertilize flowering plants. Human beings do not have to be farmers or gardeners to also make a private contribution to this, because everyone can do something to protect habitats for all living creatures in the wild. A great deal can be done, especially in this way. If the human being takes the responsibility to never dispose of plastic, other plastics or other waste in nature, but to put it in the waste collection system, even if a fee has to be paid for it. This is about the continuity of nature as a whole, its fauna and flora and humanity itself, because all life forms depend on the functioning of all ecosystems and can only exist if they are healthy all round. And these ecosystems also include all insects, which must not simply be completely destroyed and exterminated because they belong to the overall life system of the planet and all life forms. And even then, they must not simply be exterminated if various of them sometimes become a nuisance and harmful to human beings and food production, because these pests also have their specific tasks to fulfill in nature. And since time immemorial, it has been proven that when living beings on Earth have been exterminated, the whole of nature, its fauna and flora, and also the human beings of Earth have suffered disadvantages and sometimes even severe damage. So it is necessary that a better food supply is maintained or even created for the whole diversity of insects. This means that the greatest possible diversity of flowering plants is also to be provided for various other life forms of the wild, that is to say the fauna and flora, whereby the palette for this ranges not only from fruit trees to chestnuts, shrubs and bushes, but also to the thousands of herbs and flowers of all genera and species of all areas on land, in mountains and on water. Even small and smallest areas and flower boxes in front of the windows already bring great effects, and this is also already eco-cultivation.
A long speech and a lot of sense. But now I would like to discuss some things privately with you, if there is nothing else you would like to say.
I do have one more thing, if you do not mind.
That is, of course, unquestionable.
Thanks. Actually, there is one more question, and that is in relation to the so-called darknet. This is the internet, but not the one that is generally known, but the dark internet, which is much more extensive than the generally known and used internet, which is only a small fraction of the whole and only the surface. In the background of this official internet net is the extremely extensive so-called darknet, which is freely accessible to connoisseurs, hackers, black marketeers, arms traffickers, sex slaves and labor slaves, traffickers in women, girls and small children, prostitution, political activists, drug traffickers and terrorists, etc., via browsers and search engines, and is beyond all control. On the darknet, virtually any person can order and buy anything, which is then paid for by bitcoins and then delivered by post. For the bitcoin's payment method, which is unknown to me, I found the following explanation on Wikipedia.
Bitcoin is a decentralized payment system that can be used worldwide and is the name of a digital monetary unit. Transfers are processed by an association of computers over the internet with the help of a special peer-to-peer application, so that unlike in conventional banking, no central processing office is needed. Proof of ownership of Bitcoin can be stored in a personal digital wallet. The conversion rate of Bitcoin into other means of payment, fiat money, is determined by supply and demand. The Bitcoin payment system was first described in 2008 in a white paper published under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. The following year, an open-source reference software was published for it. The Bitcoin network is based on a decentralized database, the blockchain, managed jointly by the participants with the help of Bitcoin software, in which all transactions are recorded. The only condition for participation is the operation of a Bitcoin client. Alternatively, one of the online services can also be used, e.g. for mobile devices. This means that the Bitcoin system is not subject to any geographical restrictions, internet access is sufficient, and can be used across countries. With the help of cryptographic techniques, it is ensured that transactions with Bitcoins can only be carried out by the respective owner and that the monetary units cannot be spent more than once. Bitcoin is therefore also referred to as cryptocurrency, although the term currency usually refers to means of payment issued by states. In German language media, the term cryptocurrency is also used.
And as far as this darknet is concerned, it is said to comprise a total of 99% of the open web, which means that only 1% of the entire internet can be used officially. I read in an article that beyond the deep web, the dark areas of the internet and the darknet begin. The anonymous networks of connected computers around the globe, whereby no central servers are used, but everything runs via other computers that are already registered in the darknet. In practice, it is reported, prospective buyers and traders must first be let in by the darknet operators, with the added factor that the websites on the darknet cannot be located using search engines such as Google, but the addresses must be passed on from one user to another. The whole system of this kind thus prevents law enforcement agencies from being able to intervene and take action against this wide-ranging and very dangerous crime. The so-called deep web contains mostly legal, password-protected archives and catalogs, and beneath this deep web level is the darknet, which is only accessible to connoisseurs, hackers, and the informed. And those who travel in this gray zone surf around anonymously. So far, it is the perfect trading place for hackers, criminals, murderers, and terrorists who find weapons for their murderous deeds, as well as explosives and drugs, saleable human beings and slaves, and everything else they are looking for in this net. Visitors to the darknet are said to be 2.5 million per day, while 57% of the darknet is said to consist of illegal content, including child pornography and the very trafficking of human beings, women, children, and infants for sex slavery. It is estimated that around 40,000 websites are active on the darknet at any given time, with the darknet drug site Silk Road alone turning over $1.2 billion in 2 years before it could be shut down by the FBI. Stolen credit cards are also traded on the darknet for as much as $7. For some time now, however, a certain cyber specialist, an American computer scientist named Chris White, is said to have developed a program, which he calls Mimex, with which the darknet can now be decrypted and, under certain circumstances, many crimes and criminal acts, murders, and large parts of the drug trade as well as other evils can be prevented. And what I am interested in now is this, whether you know anything about this, and if so, to what extent what I have recited from an article corresponds to reality.
What you have explained is indeed known to me, and I therefore did not want to interrupt you in your flow of speech, because it was certainly good that you have explained the whole thing in some detail, because an explanation is necessary. But as I am also aware, it is correct with the Mimex program, as a result of which various things on the darknet can be uncovered and those who are guilty can be caught and punished. In fact, however, it will take a very long time until everything is reduced to such an extent that then only small dangers can emerge from the whole thing. But now, dear friend, we should come to our private conversation, which is also important.